So first of all, Toon, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
It's great to have you here, and just off the back of quite a significant fundraise as well, which we'll go into in a little bit more detail. But I want to start the conversation with something that's going through the journey of how this even started. So most founders can point to a specific time when their company was actually born. Yours is actually quite unusually vivid. You just returned from a motorcycle through 30 countries, and almost immediately a friend's father came home from chemotherapy in pain because a nurse couldn't find his vein. How does a mechanical engineer who's just driven around the world end up deciding that blood drawing is a thing he's going to dedicate the next decade of his life to?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So first of all, this question already was asked a couple of years before I started the company. As you mentioned, like a good friend of mine, his father was diagnosed with cancer. He had chemotherapy, very difficult to draw blood from his veins. He said, like, can we not improve this procedure with technology after multiple unsuccessful attempts? We started looking at it, and one of the first questions that you need to answer is like, okay, is there a real business need for this, right? So we started to talk to a lot of labs and hospitals to really understand what do they want. And although the idea came from patient experience, a better patient experience, a better blood draw, we already found out soon that the hospitals and the labs that we were talking to, they face severe staffing shortages. Very hard for them to get the right people, and even if they have them, retention is difficult. Just difficult to keep them excited about their work and just a high churn. So that was the first problem that they were facing. Secondly, what we found out is also that the labs, they have seen automation over the last 20 to 30 years, because the lab, so where the diagnostics has been done, is completely automated in the last 30 years, because before they were counting cells and now it's all done by those analyzers. So they've seen the pivot from doing things manually to automated. And that's for the analytical phase, where they do the analysis. Also for the post-analytical phase, so where they basically report the results that from the analyzers back to the physician or the patient, but not for the pre-analytical phase, so where the blood is being drawn for the patient. So we figured, okay, this is really something that they're looking at, because they are in a mindset of like automating and standardizing the whole process. And if something is not standardized, it's the blood drawing. It's actually only part in the whole chain that has not been automated yet and standardized yet. So that's where we were going to focus on, and we did a lot of interviews and decided, okay, this is really an opportunity to build a business around.
Okay, so what actually happens with bad blood draw? Why does it cause so many problems at this point?
Well, so first of all, it's an unpleasant experience for the patient. But secondly, what people often don't know is that the quality of the blood highly depends on how you draw blood. So hemolysis can occur during the blood draw, which means that the red blood cells can rupture, and therefore you cannot analyze the blood anymore. And that is something that people don't know, and it highly depends on how you draw blood. So by standardizing the procedure, you can eliminate those, or almost eliminate those hemolysis, the occurrence of hemolysis. That is critical, and hemolysis is discovered once the sample is sent to the lab, and then the results are reported back to the physician. So especially in more like urgent settings, it's very important that you get the right results. So by doing the blood draws better, you can eliminate that. And what we see now, if you look at like a phlebotomist that is very skilled, the hemolysis rates can be like a factor 10 lower than from an unskilled professional in, for example, an emergency department. So automation can help a lot.
Awesome. So when you had this idea, so that motorcycle ride, coming back after that, how did you start pulling together a business off the back of that, and what did you first start with?
So step number one was talking to a lot of people, and especially people in the business. So people who ran the labs in the hospitals or private labs, to really understand what is the problem. Because if there's not a problem, they're not willing to pay for it. And understanding the dynamics of the business case. So I looked at it really from a business perspective, and not at all from an engineering perspective at the start. So once we had scheduled those meetings and we got like the excitement of the physicians and the clinical chemists and the pathologists, which are the specialists in our field, we we said, okay, well, there's definitely a business need for this. Let's do like an FTO check, and let's make sure that we can, well, get some experts together to get their opinion on how difficult is it to create such a device that can autonomously do blood draws. So the engineering like check came after the business check, and I think that's what is very different from many other like medical startups or startups in general. It's often I would say engineering push or a technology push, because they invent something in academia, for example, and then see like, okay, where can we use this for what application? Whereas we did it the other way around by first looking at what is the problem and how can we then solve the problem. So I think and that approach worked very well, because if we look back, we founded the company about 9 years ago. So looking back 8 to 9 years ago, the whole business case and did not change. So the business case, like that all did not change. Obviously, we made very different changes from a product management perspective, but the business case remained the same.
Because that's quite interesting, because you studied as a mechanical engineer. However, you're actually in industry in the business side of things. So tell us about your lead up in career up until founding the company.
Yeah, so I studied mechanical engineering, and I graduated. I did my master's in mechanical engineering. When I was a student, I met my co-founder, Brian Joseph, and he at the time had a software company that was acquired by a huge multinational huge US multinational, and we worked together on that deal. So the acquisition of that company, which was a very interesting process and took like 9 months. And then, after my engineering graduation, I already knew like I love engineering, I love innovation, but I'm not like the person that's gonna engineer things myself. So I'm not like, hey, if the founders are really good at technology, I'm really good at understanding it, but I'm not necessarily the best mechanical or systems engineer out there. So I decided to go to work at Bain & Company. So management consulting, one of the main competitors of McKinsey, who's probably a more familiar name. So I worked there for a couple of years, really to gain experience on the business side, focusing on primarily M&A and private equity. So it's something completely different from my engineering background, and that also led to how I approached founding Vitestro. Because the business first and then engineering.
Absolutely. So did you always know you wanted to go into the world of entrepreneurship, or did you find the problem and entrepreneurship found you?
No, so I always knew that I was gonna like found my own business. But when I graduated, I thought, I'm a little bit too inexperienced. I would love to work in a professional environment. That's the reason why I joined Bain & Company, which was a great school to teach me a lot. Before I really started the business. So I already figured, okay, I'm not going to do this straight from university. I really want to have a couple of years of working experience before founding the business. And that turned out to be very helpful. It expanded the scope, the skill set, but also the network. So still some people that I know from my first job are involved in the company, which has turned out very helpful.
Awesome. So we're going to bring it back to Vitestro now. So you found the company, you've done all the interviews, found out there was a big problem in this sector, and so a business case. How did you think about actually solving it to start off with? Was it immediately obvious autonomy was the idea, or was it something else that you were originally looking at first?
So we really started with automating the blood drawing procedure. So we already knew, okay, we're gonna automatically or robotically insert a needle into a patient, and we're gonna do everything autonomously, because there were already some tools available at the time who can help phlebotomists find the veins. But that's obviously not solving the problem for the labs and hospitals, which is labor shortage and sanitization. So we wanted to automate it completely with a robotic device. That said, like initially we really focused on basically answering 3 questions. So the first question was, can we find the vein? Then once we have found the vein, can we insert a needle into the vein? And then the third, but very importantly, and maybe even most importantly, do patients really want to use this technology? So what is the patient adoption? Are they excited about using such a technology? Because very differently from surgical robotics is that the patient is conscious during this procedure, whereas with surgical robotics, the patient is unconscious. So patient adoption is a completely different. You need to look at that from a completely different lens. So we focused on those two questions. So we first built a, well, I would say, a functional model of a tool that can find the veins of the patient. Then we started with a prototype to really insert needles in patients. So going through all the medical ethics committees to run a clinical trial on that. And we did, last but probably most importantly, we did many studies on adoption, patient adoption. So to really understand like how does the brain of a patient works during blood drawing procedure. And because eventually like the technology can be great, our customers will potentially like the product from a standardization perspective and a labor shortage perspective. But then if the patient is not willing to use your product, then you don't have a business. So that was definitely one of the main focus areas from the start.
Okay. So that's super interesting, that piece around the customer adoption. So it is autonomous blood drawing, but do you have any kind of staff in the room whilst the patient is having their blood drawn?
Yeah, so the plan is to have one person supervising several devices at the same time. So we believe, also based on what we have seen in all the surveys and studies that we've done, that this human touch is still very important. That doesn't need to be in a one-to-one setting. It can be in a multiple devices setting. But this like phlebotomist or nurse or healthcare worker that come up to you like, hey, you're all set, you're good to go, you can press the start button, and then moves to the next device and patient. That's something that is critically important. And there's some patients that are very self-supporting and can do the whole procedure by themselves, whereas others, they just need more time and they need some help. So for those patients, this supervisor is really meant to help them and assist them where needed.
So I can completely see that, because needles, my partner, big phobia of needles. So if she didn't have a human in the loop in this case, she would be like, there's a robot and it's got a needle and going into my arm is going to be pretty scary. So I can completely see that human in the loop, but didn't really think about it as one-to-many devices, which is quite interesting. So you've pulled this all together into a company, you've done some kind of early studies, you've started to find the blood, a device which can find the vein on the human. Talk to me about when this became a bit more kind of serious. Where does it move in from prototype into, wow, this is really something that's going to work here?
Yeah, so we, when we get the data, and especially the data on patient adoption was important also for like raising our initial rounds. So what we found out on that patient adoption data is that, well, first of all, patients in a phlebotomy setting, so in a phlebotomy environment, behave very differently from like being in a birthday party and sitting next to each other with a beer, for example, talking about a robotic device. So if somebody with a white coat walks up to you and say, hey, today we're gonna use a device to draw your blood. Oh, and by the way, all these like hundreds of thousands or thousands of patients has already like gone before you. Like patients don't question the device. It's just like, oh, it's there, and because this person tells me I'm going to use the device, it's good. So just the same thing as you're going to use an MRI or a CT scan in the hospital, you're not going to question yourself, is this device going to work or not? You just basically do what they ask from you. So we already figured out that that's not our biggest problem, and we got quite some data on that, and we made like the device so intuitive as possible. So really thinking about like design elements, how can we make it as like patient friendly as possible, and that's what we translated those learnings into a device where we combined the learnings of our initial prototype, but also combined the patient adoption learning into like one system. And to test that, we first built mock-ups, so basically the system without any technology in there, to test that with patients, because asking a patient or a physician or a doctor or like anyone else, like, do you want to use the system? But they don't know like, how does the system look? Like, what is the size? What is it interacting? Is it patient friendly? Yes or no? So building this system without any technology in there to see how patients and physicians respond was incredibly important. So that's what we have done. So we have really like that's what we took along in the design journey. So patient experience was one of the major focus areas when we made our product. And that really helped to accelerate product development, because sometimes a patient a requirement for patient adoption doesn't help from a technology perspective, because ideally you might want to have like a black box where you stick your arm in from an engineering perspective, much easier than like a super slick design well, very good looking system. So that's something that took quite some effort, but I mean, we managed to do that, and that's I think also what our investors saw, that's the promise. And I think one additional element that really helped is that, well, if you look at it from a surgical robotic perspective, you have like this pyramid where you have those high value procedures but low volume. So for example, intuitive, they do with on the average utilization of a intuitive system is probably 2 to 3 patients a week. And then the bottom side of the pyramid is like blood drawing, which is the most commonly performed invasive procedure in the world. High volume, lower value, and that's where we play. So that was clearly seen by many of the other medical robotics investors.
Understood. So on that journey with physicians and patient users on this, what was the most surprising thing that you saw? How were people using it in a way you weren't expecting them to use it?
Well, I think one of the there are a couple of things here, because for example, what was very surprising to me is that you would expect that elderly are less likely to adopt technology, and that's also what we expected, because there's a supervisor, for example, patients that have difficulties with a robotic system, you can imagine that are typically more elderly. And so we did a lot of testing, and our assumption was that elderly, or our hypothesis was that elderly were less willing to use the system than younger people. What was interesting, and one of the big learnings, is that actually the other way around, which is like counterintuitive to me. The reason why that is the case is that younger people in their 20s, they probably haven't had any blood draws in their life. Maybe they had 1 or 2. So they are still, I would say, anxious for the procedure. Whereas elderly, we did a survey, and some of them, they go to the hospital every week to get their blood drawn. So they do it 50 times a year, or some of them, most of them do it 60%, do it 4 or more times per year. So go every quarter for a blood draw. Wow. So you can imagine they are so used to this procedure that the procedure itself, they're not anxious about it. They're anxious about the difference in personnel. So they sometimes get somebody that is super skilled and can find them very easily, whereas others have very difficulties finding their veins. So having a system that consistently draw their blood, that's what they really need. So the elderly turn out to be, even I think the younger part also, the younger patients also like the product, but the elderly even more than the younger, which we didn't expect before we started the company and did all this testing.
That's super cool. That's really interesting, because I would have had that same mindset as you, as younger adopt, more technology, you'd think that it'd be easier. But yeah, that's super interesting. And you said there was a second thing as well that you'd learned.
Well, I think this was definitely the most important thing, but the second thing, and I already alluded to it earlier in the conversation, is that once you place a product in the hospital, and the product looks good, right? It's a professional looking product, and there is a physician in a white coat walking up to you saying hey, would you like to use the system today? Basically everyone says yes. And that adoption data is close to 100%. We even had, at some point, we did trials. We were getting patients from the phlebotomy department and asked them on the spot, would you like to participate in our trial? And there was a long waiting time. So the waiting time for the regular path, regular process, was 45 minutes to an hour. And we asked people to participate in the trial randomly, and those could skip the line. So they could just join our trial. And at some point in time, there was a fight in the waiting room why they could participate in our trial and others not, because then we were allowed to skip the line. Just to give you an impression on how important it is that for such a procedure, and once there is patient adoption and everyone sees hey, they're using the system, the barrier is almost zero, right? They had to sign like clinical trial papers, but they still were willing to do that because they can just skip the line and just go in front of everyone. So that's also very interesting learning.
I want to take a minute to say thank you to our sponsors, TTP. TTP is a leader in complex medical device development. With deep scientific and engineering expertise, they help medtech teams crack tough development challenges and make the right calls early, reducing rework, delays, and uncertainty later on. Whether you're navigating uncharted technical territory or racing towards market, TTP brings clarity and real-world judgment to the decisions that shape performance, usability, and manufacturability. By retiring risk early and grounding innovation in real-world constraints, they help you move forward with speed and confidence. To find out more, check out the show notes.
That is quite cool. I guess the first one, trying to convince them, is tougher than 5, 10, 20 after they've seen so many people go and do it.
Yeah.
Super interesting. So from this journey then, you're collecting all this clinical data. Tell me more about what state the company is in at this stage when you're starting to gather all this patient data.
You mean like where we are today?
You could do today or at the time when you were learning all this information about the system. You've been on quite a journey so far, so I don't want to gloss over.
Yeah, so at the time we got all the data, we started working on our product where we are basically today. A lot of learning since then. At the start you don't know what your exact requirements should be because there's no predicate device, there's no like other device where you can benchmark yourselves against. So it's very difficult to, from an engineering perspective, to know like, okay, this should be my requirement. For example, what should be the accuracy of the tip of the needle? That's one of the requirements, but like, should it be like a 0.1, 0.2, 0.3 millimeters or should it be much more? Does it matter? You know, so really finding out what are the requirements for the system. So once we had done that, also based on the clinical data that we had gathered, we were able to start developing our final product, which we are like today. And then I think what I learned a lot is that there's a functional model, for example, then you're building on a prototype, and then you're building on your final product. And people always told me like, hey, like if there's like 1 unit of work to build a functional model, then a prototype is like 10 units of work, and then a final product is like 100 units of work. Like it's like a factor 10 the amount of work every step. And that is something that I've seen over the last couple of years that's absolutely true. Because having something that works to something that is like reliable and scalable is a huge step. It's a huge step. And I think that's super underestimated how much like engineering effort, but also operations effort it is to scale a product from it works to a real product. Because with a real product, you have to think about, okay, is it searchable? Can we calibrate in the field? Can we easily swap modules in the especially for such a larger medical robotics? Can we swap modules? So serviceability is critical. Manufacturability is crucial. Like how you're going to scale, how you're going to ramp. And if you don't think about that up front, you have a problem down the road. But also from an engineering perspective, reliability, remote access of the system. Well, these days with cybersecurity measures of the FDA, or at least like they're super strict on cybersecurity. So having that all in place, like building this environment in the cloud where you can store your data, then you get the GDPR, HIPAA, so all the compliance that comes along with it. We have the MDR and we have the FDA, but then there's so much more than those two regulatory bodies. So going from this prototype to a final product, the amount of effort that is required in order to really scale, that's definitely like a big amount of effort.
And how much do you have to personally reinvent yourself as you go through that journey? So prototype through to today, this is your first entrepreneurial journey. So how many times have you had to learn, change, adapt yourself to the different stages of the business?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we started the business with the two of us, right? Me and my co-founder Brian, and then now we are with a company of like 130, growing to like well over 100 now. FTE, which is a completely different company, different size. I think if I look back, like the first couple of years building the business, that's something that I did not always enjoy. So because it was just very small, and some of the founders, most founders, I think they love that stage. Whereas well, those first 2-3 years were really push for me, and then it started to get a little bit larger, and then I would say I was enjoying it more. So am I now. So I think for me, I start enjoying the work more over time. But yeah, you have to make a lot of changes over time. So, well, initially we only had an engineering team. We didn't have like operations, service, maintenance. Well, you don't have those teams at all, because you're doing that yourself, basically. Or at least also the business development, me and my co-founder. So the company needs to evolve over time, and so you need to do it yourself as well. So we changed. Well, initially the management team was just an engineering management team because it was only engineering in the company and some clinical work, but that was basically it. Well, now we're at a completely different stage where we are running I would say, real company with HR, finance, commercial, engineering, operations. So now it's, and you need to go through that transition, which is not always easy because you have to make some more difficult decisions. There are people that are able to grow with the company and others that are not able to, well, join that growth or are just very good at what they do and you would like to keep them, but maybe not on a leadership position anymore if the company scales. So those are like difficult trade-offs because you have long-standing relationships with those people. You know they're very good at their job, but their job at some point in time, and if their job evolves as well, then the question is, are they still the right person to do their job, right? So I think that's that's always a difficult trade-off, and I think we went through those stages quite efficiently. And while looking back, there's so many people that joined in our first 2 to 3 years that are still with the company, the majority of them, which is always a great sign if you're still in business after 8 years.
For sure. And so doing it for the first time, how do you get comfortable with making those decisions? How do you know when is the right time to, like, engineering is done or not? It's never done, but engineering is at a stage where we need to start thinking about manufacturability of this, or now we're in kind of manufacturability and operations, now we need to start thinking about the service. How do you start making the decisions from doing this the first time that you need to start focusing on all those different elements?
Yeah, so I think it's also a matter of like getting the right people on board, and it's a little bit cliche, but that's how it is. So we have quite a lot of talent in the company. Initially, my co-founder had done it before, at least like not a medical device and not necessarily a hardware product, which is very differently than a software product, but at least like running a business. So that was already very helpful. And then over time, well, the company matured. We got a more professional board. And quite some useful advisors who have helped us along the way. So also with them, like, okay, now it's now time to professionalize this part of the business, then that part of the business. So I think getting the right people around you to also support you in that journey, and those that already have gone through those phases is super helpful.
Of course. And so that kind of brings us on to the investor conversation as well. So one thing I've been impressed by in your journey is the fundraising and the quality of the cap table that's come about as a part of it. So talk us through maybe the last fundraise and then the most recent one, and tell us a little bit about that cap table and the investor base that you've got on board now.
Yeah, so we have a very good investor base, I would say, of very supportive investors. So one of the initial investors in the company was Sonner Capital. So that was so after the angel rounds, they joined. So they're based in the West Coast in the US. Fred Moll being on the board already for the last 4 years, which is very helpful given his network. And then from there we expanded. We expanded the investor base. So we got basically now some Dutch investors. We got some US investors, including some strategics, and a South Korean investor. spread around really. But last round we have a couple of strategic investors included on the cap table. So NYBC, which is New York Blood Center, their investment arm already invested previous round. And last round, LabCorp joined us, which is a major strategic for us because they employ almost 20,000 phlebotomists. It's massive. So they joined. Sutter Health joined, a big health system on the West Coast in the US. Mayo Clinic joined as well. So we have quite some strategic investors on the cap table, and then some medtech investors. So Sonner being one of them, but also Puma Ventures joined. Intervest, South Korean VC. Investinel, which is Dutch-based VC. PGGM, pension funds who focus on like healthcare in the Netherlands. So we have quite some investors on board with a very, very relevant network to what we're doing, and that's always in benefit of the company.
So we talked about Intuitive a little bit earlier in this conversation. Lots of people who do listen to this will know who Fred Moll is, but Fred Moll is effectively the founder and starter of Intuitive Surgical and also Orbis Health, and now sits on the board of many surgical robotics companies. But what is the effect that he has on your business, and joining that first Series A round, how has he helped shape the company as it's moved forward through these stages?
We're using his network a lot, where he can be very helpful. He worked with so many people in the past that are very familiar to medical robotics. For example, our FDA consultants, different advisors in the US who can help us with our FDA journey as well. So that's where he has been very helpful. And I think next to Fred, also worth mentioning is we're a bit on the edge of medical robotics on one hand, and the other hand, like diagnostics. So Dave Hickey joined the board as well about 1.5 years ago, who was the executive vice president of life sciences at BD. So in the board of directors of BD. So he's been very helpful as well, especially in the diagnostic space, because that's where we play. Having the right people on the board and being involved with the company can really accelerate the business.
Excellent. And so let's talk about today. Where is the business at right now, and what's the next steps that are going to happen?
Yeah, so we launched our first generation product, very limited market release of that, has some learnings, and we're now basically optimizing aspects of the product, especially like I said before, like remote connection, making it serviceable, but also really preparing for scaling. And then commercialization, early commercial launch will start next year in Europe, and then we are also obviously working on FDA and working on the US, but first focus now is our European commercial launch. So we have signed quite some contracts with quite some labs and hospitals. So for the first year, we've basically filled our pipeline and we can just deploy the systems. So I'm super excited about next year and about like the growth that will come forward next year.
What are you most obsessed with in the business at the minute? What's kind of the one thing that you're so, I guess, maniacally focused on with this product and company?
First of all, scalability, which is incredibly important, and then secondly, customer experience. So we're going to launch those generation 2 systems in the field. Those first 10 customers, they need to be extremely happy. So we believe it's so much better to focus on those initial 10 customers to make them super excited than going out selling like hundreds of systems with tens of customers. And then, some of them are very happy. Some of them, might also say, I'm not sure. We believe that like the focus on this first couple of customers is extremely important. So we're doing basically everything to make that possible. And that is really where my focus is today.
Okay. And what's going to make those first 10 a success? What are the fundamentals you're putting in place there?
Well, basically we agree with them on like patient. Well, we have agreements on patient adoption, the KPIs of the system, how they're going to use the system, our level of support on site to make this system a success. And what we are doing is not just building a device and selling it to a hospital or to a lab. We are basically providing them with a solution. And a solution means that, well, providing them with the device only is not sufficient. So we're going to make with them together workflow changes, like really making sure that this system is embedded in their way of working, daily way of working. That's the only way how we can succeed as a company if you're changing the current standard of care completely. And that's what we're doing. So those learnings with those customers, we're preparing them now in like a huge level of depth together with them. And we already have a lot of experience. We have a couple of systems already running in the field over the last 12 months. So they are deployed, and those learnings we're translating, making it better and better and better to make it really a scalable model.
And what's going to be the moment where you say, I'm happy, let's go now and do a full commercial rollout?
Well, I think it's after those happy customers. That's the most important metric. And let's see when it will be in time. Cool.
So, kind of bringing the conversation around now. So, what do you want the world to know about Vitestro at this point in time? What's the things that you want everyone to know about now you're kind of ready to go to the market in this sense?
I believe it's, and otherwise I wouldn't be the CEO, but I believe it's like a huge opportunity to improve healthcare with robotics. And we're addressing a huge problem. It's just blood drawing is the most commonly invasive procedure in the world. So addressing that problem with like tens of thousands of phlebotomists out there, it's a huge opportunity what we're working on, and I'm super excited about the journey.
Okay, so if we have a conversation in 5 years' time, what would success look like to you with this company?
So success looks like having many devices deployed in Europe and in the US for sure. Those are our primary markets for now. Well, especially having drawn blood of millions and millions of patients. That's what success looks like.
Cool. Well, from my side, Toon, I've had a really good conversation today. So just to say, thank you very much for joining me today.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining me on the Crux of MedTech podcast. If you're not already doing so, please go ahead and subscribe on YouTube or follow the podcast on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast is proudly brought to you by Crux. Crux is a medtech search firm which places pioneers in transformative roles to help us live longer, healthier lives. We do 3 things for companies. We help hire world-class executive talent. We help companies raise investment from Series A to Series C and execute upon M&A. And we also are building a community of medtech leaders to facilitate peer-to-peer learning and accelerate the companies to help them go faster. If you're interested in any of those 3 things, please reach out to me on LinkedIn or follow the link in the show notes to find out more. Thank you.